Welcome to the History and Geography of Natural Psychoactive Substances. Today's lecture is on Kava, or Kava as it's often called. Kava is the most important traditional drug of the Pacific Islands. Important to note that the Pacific was essentially an alcohol-free zone until the modern era. And Kava, in many, not all, but many Pacific societies occupied a similar role to that occupied by alcohol in most other parts of the world. It's interesting to look at the classification of Kava as a drug. It's generally classified as a depressant, which is not surprising considering the fact that it has sedative, analgesic or pain relieving, anxiolytic or anxiety reducing, and euphoriant properties. Other depressants such as alcohol and opium have all of these same properties as well. Now, the euphoriant property is by no means limited to depressants. It's found in a variety of different psychoactive substances, including a number of stimulants and others. Kava is, although similar to alcohol in many regards, it's almost always regarded as less intoxicating, less impairing, certainly fewer motor impairing effects than alcohol, opium, or really any other depressant. And like alcohol, but unlike opium, Kava is associated with enhanced sociability. It's very much a social drug. Now, of course, alcohol is not always a social drug, but when it is not consumed in social occasions, it's usually considered more damaging. Anyway, the interesting question is whether Kava is disinhibiting like alcohol. That's one of the main traits of alcohol consumption. It tends to take away inhibitions, which can have both productive and destructive effects. I spent quite a bit of time trying to find out information on this. Ultimately, the best source I found anyway was ChatGPT. I'm suspicious about overusing it, but it can be an important tool. Anyway, ChatGPT tells us that the disinhibiting effect of Kava can manifest as reduced social anxiety, increased sociability, and a sense of calm, making people feel more at ease in social settings. However, it does not cause the same level of disinhibition as alcohol, and users often remain more mentally clear and in control while experiencing its effect. And this is something that most sources emphasize, that it has it's a sort of a mentally clearer high, if you will. Kava is very complicated biochemically. The active components are called cavalactones, and there are at least 18 different ones. I'm not going to go into the biochemistry, but I will note that the major cavalactones potentiate GABA receptors and inhibit the reuptake of norepinephrine and dopamine. So in other words, complicated biochemical processes. And cavalactones are a class of compounds, but evidently they're fairly rare. They're found in kava roots, a plant called shell ginger, perhaps a few others, but not widely spread. There's been quite a bit of research anyway recently on of these 18 different cavalactones. What is the main, or is there a main psychoactive component? And kavain is now the leading contender for that. To quote, this is a Wikipedia quote I should note, has anticonvulsive properties. To what extent this mechanism is involved in its anxiolytic, in other words, anxiety reducing, and analgesic, or in other words, pain reducing, effects on the nervous system is unknown. The recent finding that kavain can reversibly inhibit both monoamine oxidase A and monoamine oxidase B suggests that kavain may exert some of its effects by modulating serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine signaling. I guess my only conclusion here was research is ongoing and more research is needed. Certainly, the effects of Kava vary a lot by cultivar, in other words, the sort of variety of the plant. Kava has been domesticated for millennia, and many different cultivars are present. and they seem to have quite distinctive effects. And this is probably related to, or probably caused by, the different profiles of these different cavalactones that they have. So here we see an illustration contrasting mind kava, heady, or body kava, heavy, with mind kava being more uplifting and euphoric, enhancing creativity and alertness, better suited for daytime, whereas body kava better for deep relaxation, sleep aid, and pain relief, better suited for nighttime. I find it interesting that this is almost exactly the same as the supposed distinction between cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, which I'll talk about in a later lecture. I'm actually quite suspicious of this very common idea that indica is a body high and sativa is a mind high. Certainly the cannabinoid profile has something to do with this, different effects, but I'm very suspicious anyway. With kava, it may be a different case altogether, however. I have had, I did try kava once, many years ago. And I'm not exactly sure how I would characterize it, but what I experienced, I suppose, was more of the mind kava. Anyway, these cultivars are so distinctive that in traditional Hawaiian society, one place where kava was consumed, one particular cultivar, moi, supposedly had a very strong cerebral effect and less of a body effect due to a high percentage of kavain, this one particular substance within it. And it has been reported that non-royals who took this royal variety could even be subjected to the death penalty. Traditional Hawaiian and in general traditional Polynesian society was very hierarchically organized. The word taboo comes from Polynesian, and taboos were often associated with things that commoners could not do that were associated with people in chiefly or especially kingly lineages. So anyway, the effects of kava, well, it depends on variety, cultivar, if you will. Depends, of course, as always, with dose, and it depends on frequency of use. So those last two issues are very common, essentially universal with recreational drug use. So we can see some very positive views of kava, some very negative ones. So the illustrations I have on the left, the positive view, kava is used medicinally for anxiety, to calm the nerves, to induce relaxation, to make it easier to sleep, to help lose weight. That's interesting. To relieve asthma and rheumatism. Not too sure about that. Cures headaches. And not too sure. Calms gonorrhea and syphilis. I'm very suspicious of that. And used as an aphrodisiac. Well, maybe. In the negative view, you could see over here some problems that are associated with kava, especially overuse or prolonged use. Sleepiness, well, that could be beneficial or not. Red eyes, numb mouth, loss of muscle control, nausea, well, that depends a lot on the cultivar. Low motivation, dermatitis issues, problems with liver enzymes. That's probably the most troublesome problem, is possible liver damage. Weight loss, poor health, kava dependency. Well, the latter ones can come evidently, but comes with prolonged heavy use. So anyway, there are plenty of people who claim that kava generates peace and tranquility. As the Wikipedia article notes, in general, noble kava refers to the more high quality cultivars that have the sort of a better profile of these kava lactones. But anyway, it brings calmness, relaxation, well-being without diminishing cognitive performance. I'd like to see some scientific studies on this. It may produce an initial talkative period followed by muscle relaxation and eventual sleepiness. I suppose one could say the same about alcohol. So that's why I'm sort of analogizing kava with alcohol, as they do have some similarities. There's been a lot of talk about using kava for psychological ailments, particularly for anxiety. Here's a study. It's a bit old, but anyway, it compares kava with a placebo and found that it was effective for anxiety, although the effect seems relatively small. More research is needed. Certainly, some people in the Pacific have a kava addiction problem, and it seems especially notable in Fiji. At least that's where I found most sources about the sort of kava problem. And according to this illustration, some 42% of Fijian men are heavy users, spend up to 20% of their income on it. Well, that's a problem. Wives often felt deprived of basic family needs because of the money spent on kava. Children underperformed in school because of lack of supervision. Interestingly, men reported they use kava to relax, improve urination, get a good night's sleep, socialize, and improve their sexual drive, whereas wives reported they were concerned about their husband's failure to fulfill their sexual desires due to lack of drive and impotence caused by kava. Some have turned to extramarital affairs. So anyway, this is a sort of a warning illustration about the problems of kava. But again, I would caution these problems seem to come about from taking too much and taking it too often. So common with mind-altering substances. And even the sexual issue, improved sexual drive and decreased sexual drive, well, both of those may be true, depending on how much is consumed and how often. The World Health Organization has weighed in fairly recently, 2016. Little documented evidence for adverse health effects with moderate consumption, and then goes on to say, well, there are problems with heavy consumption. Skin rash, weight loss, nausea, loss of appetite, indigestion can result in red eyes, laziness, loss of sex drive, in general, poor health. These effects are considered reversible upon cessation of use. An effect on cognition, which might be associated with the pharmacological activity of kava, has not been identified. So again, more research is needed. One common view, though, in much of the Pacific and the Kava zone is whatever its problems are, it's better than alcohol. Societies that never had any traditional use of alcohol often find a great many difficulties that come in when alcohol is introduced. This may be a cultural thing. It may even have genetic or physiological issues in that society in which people have been consuming alcohol for thousands of years, people can physiologically adapt better to it. So it's certainly true in much of North America, what is now the U.S. and Canada, where alcohol was not known when it was introduced by European settlers. Many indigenous people had a real hard time with it, fairly high rates of alcohol abuse and alcohol addiction. So alcohol has caused a lot of problems in the Pacific, but some common observations associated with kava include: you cannot hate with kava in you. Unlike liquor, it does not provoke aggression, boisterous, or violent behavior. The mind remains sharp and clear. However, those who have drunk a great deal can grow tired, stare vacantly, and get wobbly legs. Well, those aren't nearly as bad as becoming violent and aggressive, as unfortunately does happen with alcohol, depending, of course, on the individual and the amount consumed. Excuse me. There's a lot of interesting aspects of the domestication and spread of kava. A lot of sort of mysteries that I think scholars are now just sort of clearing up. So this is a map I made. I cannot vouch for its accuracy. I spent a lot of time trying to find which islands people did or did not consume kava on. For Papua New Guinea, you could see there just a corner, the eastern peninsula. And I'm not exactly sure if that's accurate. I spent quite a few hours making this map and eventually decided that I was getting diminishing returns. But there's very clearly a core zone that I have circled there with dotted lines, and then a broader zone It is, though, it has more recently spread. I have one error going to Northern Australia. Northern Australia is where the largest percentage of Australian Indigenous people or Aboriginals live, and they had no history of kava use, but evidently it has spread. And it has spread to some of the other islands, though I didn't show this on this map. One very interesting thing about this kava core zone is it spans the border between Melanesia and Polynesia. Now, the division of the Pacific Islands into these three groups, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, is very common. It's problematic as well. These are all terms derived by European first voyagers, then scholars. They come from Greek. Polynesia means many islands. Micronesia means tiny islands, and Melanesia means dark or black islands. So that doesn't tell you very much. Of these groups, though, Polynesia is the best cultural group. All Polynesian peoples speak very closely related languages, have similar cultures, although it certainly varies from island to island. There's often a big difference just simply between the larger islands and the smaller islands, where traditionally Polynesian society was very hierarchical on the large islands, but more egalitarian on the small islands that couldn't support an aristocracy or let alone a kingdom. So Maori language of New Zealand, Hawaiian, Tahitian, these are Samoan, Tongan, these are all closely related languages and some pretty similar cultural practices. Micronesia is kind of a catch-all. I won't really talk about that. Some Micronesian islands, people have traditionally used kava, like Korsare, Ponape, and the Federated States of Micronesia, not in the Marshall Islands. But Melanesia is an interesting case. It means dark or black islands because of the darker skin color of its indigenous inhabitants. Melanesia was, at least I should say, Western Melanesia was settled many tens of thousands of years ago by human beings. It got to New Guinea maybe 50,000 BCE, so very early, and then later spread as far as the Solomon Islands. But the Melanesian people have some genetic affinity with Australian indigenous people, the Australian so-called Australian Aborigines. They developed farming in New Guinea, actually at a very early period, and relatively large populations. There's no Melanesian language group. Actually, a lot of Melanesian people speak languages in the Austronesian family, which is the same family that includes Polynesian and languages of Indonesia, Philippines, and Madagascar. But it is kind of curious that we have this core zone, and includes the definitely Melanesian islands of Vanuatu, formerly called the New Hebrides. It includes Fiji, which is classified as Melanesian, mostly on the physical appearance of its indigenous inhabitants, although culturally Fiji is sort of in between in between Polynesia and Melanesia. Most Melanesian societies were small scale, relatively egalitarian. You tend to get a lot of ethnic differentiation. Vanuatu has, I think, 300,000 people and something like 100 languages. When you get to Polynesia, each island group essentially had one language, and they're closely related to other ones. Fiji, though, is a bit in between. It's had a lot of contact historically with Tonga, especially, and the Fijians have languages. They're not Polynesian, but they're pretty closely related to the Polynesian group, and they have a lot of traditional cultural practices that are, again, have some Polynesian aspects and some that are more reminiscent of the Melanesian islands. So anyways, no surprise, scholars have tried to figure out, where was kava domesticated? Who domesticated? How did it spread? Why do we get these patterns? There's evidence from biology. The kava plant, Piper methisticum, does not grow in the wild. It was developed from a related species. Some scientists say they're really the same species, Piper witchmani, and that wild progenitor grows only in Melanesia. It's found in New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, Solomon Islands, down into Vanuatu. It is not found anywhere in Polynesia. So that may make one come to the conclusion that no, it was not Polynesians who developed this. It was people further to the west in Melanesia. But that doesn't seem to be the case. We have to go a little bit, again, into some detail here with language and prehistory and settlement. But as I said before, New Guinea, the Bismarck Islands, which you can see in blue on the map, and the Solomon Islands had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years. Beyond that, islands like Vanuatu, New Caledonia, and Fiji, now classified as Melanesian, were uninhabited until around 1500 BC or BCE. And the story has been figured out through archaeological explorations, finds of pottery, through historical linguistics and others. And what seems to happen was a group of people speaking an Austronesian language. Austronesians were the first people to develop long-distance oceanic voyaging technologies and techniques, and they could leave sight of land and sail into the open sea. They got all the way to Madagascar from what is now Indonesia, but they had settled in the Philippines as well as Indonesia. And around 1500 BC, probably one group of these left the Philippines. People think it's the Philippines because of pottery similarities. But anyway, went down and sailed into the Bismarck Archipelago, coast of New Guinea. These areas were inhabited. The Lapita people were more coastal. The indigenous peoples probably a bit more interior in their orientation, but the Lapita people intermarried with the indigenous Melanesians, and we can tell that from genetic analysis and also from just the appearance of the people, so physical appearance. Then later on, they moved into the area here in that's sort of into the other blue color. You can see on the map, including Vanuatu, New Caledonia, and Fiji. It goes on into Tonga and Samoa. These were uninhabited islands. So it was the Austronesian people who maintained their language and most of their culture, but picked up some genetic component from Melanesian peoples, probably in the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomons. And then they started going into uncharted, well, all these seas were uncharted, but into areas that had never been settled by human beings before. In the area around Tonga and Samoa, offshoot group called the Polynesian population develops. Polynesian is a subfamily of the larger Austronesian family. And then they started voyaging and settling islands as far away as Hawaii, Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, and New Zealand had been entirely uninhabited. Now, let's get back to Kava. The greatest diversity of Kava cultivars are found in Vanuatu, formerly the New Hebrides. So this is, again, a Melanesian island by the appearance of people and by their cultural practices, not Polynesian by any stretch of the imagination. It's a language map on the left, and you can see the lines across those islands are distinct languages. And again, there are only 300,000 people or so in this entire country. So there's tremendous ethnic diversity. That's something you do not find in Polynesian islands. Also, traditionally, smaller scale, more egalitarian societies. So Vanuatu was originally uninhabited. The Austronesians move in, and then they seem to, this is probably the area where they start to use kava as a natural plant and then start selecting the varieties that are better, give a better drug experience. And it's interesting that in Vanuatu, where you have this great diversity of cultivars, we have the noble cultivars, which are well known as sort of the preferred substance, But then there's something that are called a 2-day Kava varieties. And the 2-day ones are much cheaper, they're much easier to grow, they mature much easier, but they have a lot more side effects, nausea, hangover, and so on. So evidently there was this long period of selecting plants to propagate. It's not propagated by seed, it's propagated by cuttings, but selecting varieties that had a better cavalactone profile, if you will. And in a lot of the islands further afield, these sort of nastier 2-day varieties did not spread. Although even there's difference in cultivars. Like I say, in Hawaii, there was one that only royalty could eat. So then what later happened was, well, like I said, the Lapita people formed the Polynesian culture in the Tonga area and then make their migrations. But then you get subsequent movements of Melanesian peoples from, well, we don't know where, from New Guinea, from the Bismarck Archipelago, probably from Solomon Islands, that's the closest, into Vanuatu and Fiji. And they intermarry with the Lapita people who were there, but genetically they kind of swamped them out, well, particularly in Vanuatu, where people definitely have a Melanesian appearance and not a Polynesian appearance. But they adopt the Austronesian languages of the Lapita, and they adopt Kava consumption. They don't adopt all the cultural practices. You don't get the kind of, for example, hierarchies that are characteristic of larger Polynesian islands. You don't get that in Vanuatu. We'll get back to Vanuatu a little bit later because there's some really interesting things about Kava consumption. But let's look a little bit about traditional consumption in Polynesian islands. And this is particularly in the larger islands, which were so highly hierarchical. So it wasn't just used for fun. It was used for important occasions, to welcome visitors, to mark the beginning and completion of big important projects, like building a ship, to prepare for ocean voyages, to install chiefs, to validate their titles, to ratify agreements and resolve conflicts. There's a lot of war and conflict between different Polynesian societies, to mark important occasions like birth, marriage, and death, and to treat illness. Now, as I mentioned before, Kava consumption in traditional Polynesian societies was closely linked to the social hierarchy and social status. So I have a diagram here of just the ancient Hawaiian hierarchy, which is probably the most intensive of any Polynesian society, where you have a king. I have an illustration here of Kamehameha I, who was the first to unify all the Hawaiian islands into one kingdom, late 1700s, early 1800s. So then you have aristocrats, you have religious leaders, you have commoners, and you have serfs or slaves. So a very extensive and complicated social hierarchy. The slaves or serfs were usually people captured in war or descendants. They were sometimes used for human sacrifice. So it was a pretty intense hierarchy. And that was reflected in traditional Kava drinking. So in a Kava circle, and this is pretty much all Polynesian societies, at least in the larger islands, where you have this hierarchy, Kava is given in order of social ranking. The top ranked man drinks first and then down, so everybody has a place. And not only in drinking, but also in speaking, the higher ranking men have priority. Lower ranking men, if they're even allowed into the Kava circle, are supposed to keep quiet until later on their time may come. And it was also, as my words have suggested, highly gendered. Usually it was only men who were allowed to drink, although interesting, post-menopausal women were put in sort of a liminal status, and they were, and sometimes in places, allowed to join the Kava circles. But also sometimes in places only the elite men could drink it. Preparation, a different matter. That was women, or actually adolescent girls, and sometimes in some places young uninitiated men who had never consumed it. So preparers and consumers are a different category. And preparation was elaborate. So to quote Wikipedia, well, traditionally it's prepared by either chewing, grinding, or pounding the roots. You have to really pound it fine. Chewing was more effective way to break it up in tiny pieces. It's done in water, and then the water is carefully wrung out, and what is left is consumed. So, like I say, in many places, the preferential way to do this was by having people, generally uh, girls or young women with good teeth and healthy mouths, would chew it up, spit it out. It would be wrung out, and then people would drink it. This is a barrier for consumption for some, as you can may imagine. And when I first read about kava, this was maybe decades ago. I believe that I read. I can't vouch for this, but I remember, at least it's in my memory somewhere, maybe a false memory, was that it had to be chewed because that's what would the enzymes in saliva would release the active components. But that's not true. You can pound it or grind it very finely. That will work, and that's how it's done more generally these days. No surprise, but kava was opposed by Christian missionaries, but there was a lot of variation. Christian missionaries were quite successful in the Pacific. Virtually all of the countries there I think all of them are probably predominantly Christian to this day. But different missionaries went to different islands and they had different ideas. Congregationalists and Presbyterians, these are faiths that are both rooted in Calvinism, which is a relatively extreme form of Protestantism. They were inclined to eradicate it. And in many islands it was essentially or nearly eradicated, including Hawaii. Methodist, Anglican, and a lot of the Catholic missionaries were generally more tolerant. And there's also a geographical difference. There was less hostility from missionaries in Fiji, mostly Methodist there, at least initially, and Western Polynesia. That may be one of the reasons why you can see this distinctive core kava zone, including including Vanuatu and Fiji and Melanesia and Tonga and Samoa in Polynesia. A lot of other Polynesian islands probably seem to have had a very well developed kava culture, but it declined because of the missionary influence. Kingdom of Tonga is very interesting. So Tonga was the only Polynesian state where the monarchy was not overthrown. Everywhere else, European imperialists came in and took over, and that was essentially, well, I wouldn't say the end. Certainly in American Samoa, there are still chiefly lineages, so there is still a pretty intense hierarchy. But Tonga was different because it became a British protectorate, but it was never really a formal British colony. In other words, the king continued to reign and to a certain extent rule during the colonial period. It had to follow the foreign policy dictates of the British advisor, but you didn't have the direct colonization that you did, say, of the United States and Hawaii, or Britain and New Zealand, or France and Tahiti, or in Samoa you had one island taken over by the Germans and later to the United States, the other to the British. But Tonga was distinctive, so there's still a Tongan royal family. It's actually quite powerful in Tonga. It's not an absolute monarchy, but it's a strong monarchy. But their Methodist missionaries were quite accommodating. Even to this day, people sometimes present kava to church leaders or dignitaries. Kava circles are sometimes used to welcome visiting preachers, and here we have a royal kava circle on Tonga. Now, the other main missionary group in Tonga was the LDS, or Mormon Church. No surprise, not accommodating. The Mormon's word of wisdom prohibits any psychoactive recreational substance. And Mormon missionaries were quite successful. I found it very interesting that the LDS Living magazine claims that Tonga's 60.88% Mormon. Britannica has it at 18%. I put those as the extremes. Most sources say it's about a third Mormon. Most of the rest of Tongans are Methodists, and Methodists are accepting of Kava, Mormons not. So let's go back to Vanuatu, or New Hebrides. I have here colonial attempt to ban kava provoked a major backlash. One interesting thing about Vanuatu, it was jointly colonized. It was as the New Hebrides, it was a condominium of France and the United Kingdom. which led to a certain amount of tension between islands which were more under French administration and ones that were more under British administration. But it's Tanna Island in the far south, which is the most intriguing and the one where this Kava prohibition attempt provoked the backlash most extensively. And this led to the rise of what is called the John Frum cargo cult in Vanuatu. So cargo cults really evolved in World War II when the United States had a large number of troops on these islands. There was one of the biggest early battles of the war in the Pacific was in Guadalcanal, which is in the Solomon Islands, just a bit to the north and west of Vanuatu. So there were a lot of American troops in Vanuatu. Recent research shows, though, that the John Frum cargo cult, which is generally associated with supposedly with an American soldier, somebody named John from America, but it's actually deeper. So stories that have been uncovered by anthropologists goes back before World War II, 1938. Supposedly a well-dressed, mysterious black man named John Frum began to appear at illegal Kava gatherings. So the state was trying to eradicate it. And he advised people to resist the authority, to return to traditional practices. So he's seen as sort of a culture hero or almost supernatural figure. Anyway, in World War II, the Americans come. They bring a tremendous amount of cargo, goods, in other words, and they employ a lot of locals. And supposedly, at least from the stories, the Americans were much less arrogant and culturally bigoted than the British and French. I mean, they weren't arrogant and culturally bigoted, but maybe a matter of difference. And eventually, John Frum, if there was an initial John Frum in the 30s, anyway, he was conflated with an American soldier, and the cargo cult developed. And what happened after World War II is the cargo went away. As the Americans went away, they were no longer bringing in all sorts of canned food and all sorts of manufactured goods, which people of Tanna were able to acquire by working for the Americans. And so they wanted a return. And so what they started to do was emulating practices that American military personnel had been doing, that build fake airstrips and a fake control tower and all sorts of practices designed to bring them back. Of course, they didn't come back, but this cargo cult transformed into a legitimate religion, you could say. And interviews with people who were members of the John Frum cargo cult would say things like, "Well, we understand, that John Frum, is not really a supernatural entity, or at least I should say this differently. We understand that American troops did not have any sort of supernatural activities, but this has become part of our own culture." Anyway, they do these large parades. You can see USA painted on them. They just have poles here substituting for guns. Anyway, according to the Wikipedia, in the 1990s, there were still about 5,000 members of this movement, essentially on the island of Tanna. But interestingly, belief has declined. 2022, only 500. Only one village is faithful to it. So it turned into a religion, but that religion evidently is disappearing. What is not disappearing, though, is the development of custom villages. So the John Frum movement, very interesting, because on the one hand, it's looking for cargo and goods from the Western world, but on the other hand, it's really pushing for traditional practices and to get away from any movement towards modernization, if you will. And that's how modern goods are going to come in. At least that's how it was sort of originally contemplated. But anyway, in these custom villages on the island of Tanna, the modern world is held at bay, as Wikipedia notes here. Some of the higher altitude villages costume villages. Here, modern inventions are restricted. Inhabitants wear grass skirts as their ancestors did, and their children do not go to public school. So the basic idea is we are going to live as our ancestors did. Ironically, extremely ironically, these villages are now being commercialized, so you can go to tourist secrets and Tana Island in Vanuatu, untouched by tourism. Well, come and visit it and touch it by tourism. Yeah, like I say, rather ironic. But just to quote this ad, the people of Tana hold deep respect for their natural surroundings and the spirits believed to inhabit the island. Costume villages are an important part. These villages follow traditional customs and practices, offering visitors a glimpse of the daily lives, traditional dwellings, and ancient ways of the Ni Vanuatu people. And you can come visit them, pay a lot of money, and someone's making money on this. Anyway, after decolonization, after World War II, Vanuatu becomes an independent country, except in French. Well, there's a few exceptions. There are still colonial holdings in the Pacific. French Polynesia has vast territory. The United States control some islands in Micronesia, Guam, Northern Marianas Islands, Western Samoa and Polynesia is the U.S. colony essentially. But most islands were decolonized and become independent. And after that, interesting, Kava begins to sort of revive, to spread, and to democratize, if you will. So it spread to a number of islands where it was not traditionally consumed. In the past, at least traditionally, Kava was consumed in ritually marked sort of special occasions. Afterwards, it becomes used much more, in some cases, more frequently, or you don't need the kind of ritual excuse, which has generated some problems, to be sure. It's also been embraced in some places, certainly in Fiji, as a symbol of cultural and national identity. Fiji, I should note, is divided between the indigenous Fijians and the Indo-Fijians, Indo-Fijians being descendants of people from northern India brought to cut sugarcane, as Fiji was a British colony, brought as indentured servants, if you will. The Indo-Fijians have controlled much of the economy. The indigenous Fijians have been more sort of politically powerful. There's been a lot of tension between the two, let's put it this way. And so the indigenous people have really re-embraced Kava, seen as an alternative to alcohol and a more healthy alternative. And also there's been a decline of hierarchy and gender restrictions. So these, in Polynesian islands, in particular, where you had these very hierarchical practices, those have very much declined. Kava is now globalizing. It's doing it in a different way, though it's moving into the wealthier parts of the world in a variety of different ways. So it's legal in the United States and in most countries. You can get all sorts of Kava extracts, although beware, because as the text on the bottom shows, the consumption of extracts produced with organic solvents or excessive amounts of poor quality Kava, because remember, Kava has these poor quality cultivars. Anyway, these may be linked to adverse health effects, including potential liver injury. Kava itself, especially if it's the non-noble cultivars and if it's consumed too much, can cause liver problems. And using organic solvents to extract the active ingredients, well, that could be associated with toxicity as well. Anyway, there's many different Kava products that one can purchase online, root powder and tincture and instant drinks. But if you want a more, authentic experience, you can go to a Kava bar. They're spreading. For a booze-free buzz, Americans are heading to Kava bars. And to quote here from this article, in the Pacific Islands, Kava is almost always served by itself. Embracing its bitter, earthy flavor serves as an opportunity for communities to reconnect with the ancestral land. Kava bars that attempt to cover up those tastes with juices and syrups are simply missing the point. I think Kava should taste like Kava, he says. Just like getting a tattoo should hurt, Kava should be bitter. Well, certainly in the United States, there's a cultural reluctance to embrace the bitter taste. It's interesting, you find much more far more bitter salads in much of Europe than you do in the United States. Americans seem to have an aversion to bitterness, and Kava is quite bitter. But anyway, some of the Kava lounges serve pretty traditional Kava, not just flavored ones. Here's a Kava lounge, Kava Lounge as it's called, in San Francisco. So we have a traditional Kava bowl and traditional, we have a larger, smaller doses. Note that it can, some of these are quite a bit on the pricey side, although you're getting somewhat large doses. Okay, so finally, to conclude, one thing I find Kava very interesting, partly because it developed in a unique natural and cultural environment, and one that did not have alcohol, which globally is fairly rare. Outside of North America and Australia, some of the Arctic regions, pretty much everyone had access to alcohol, but not in the Pacific. It's interesting that they never developed it. I mean, there's a lot of fruit there, and palm trees, and fruit and palm sap will readily ferment. But anyway, they didn't have alcohol, and Kava sort of fit the role that alcohol does in many other societies. Something that people would drink to relax together, convivial environment, make people more inclined to have discussions, but evidently without many of the drawbacks that alcohol has. So I find that intriguing. I also find the fact that it has such complicated biochemistry that is really not well understood, and you have this whole class, a category of psychoactively chemicals that are found mostly just in Kava, although in a few other plants. Then it has this unusual geohistorical pattern where it's spread widely, and then you get modern era restrictions, and then now you have a spread again, both within Oceania, within the Pacific, but also then jumping to world cities where you can find Kava bars in places like San Francisco, New York, Chicago. I'm sure you find them in a number of European cities. And then just the interesting question of whether it should be considered as an alternative to alcohol, particularly for people who have problems with alcohol, although it may be the case that people who have problems with alcohol will also have problems with Kava, because certainly some people do have problems with Kava, drink it to excess and too often. So it is still dangerous, but I find a very, very intriguing substance, and I'm thinking of doing my own little field trip to a Kava bar. Like I said, I did try Kava. Actually, I was in high school. A friend got it through some mail order company. We were intrigued by things like that. My friends and I, we chewed it up. Everyone chewed up their own, and we spat it out, and we wring it out, and we all drank our own saliva laden with Kava. And we had a very interesting time. That may have been partly from suggestibility. I would like to repeat the experiment. So thank you so much. I hope you find this interesting. The next Geocurrents lecture on the historical geography of psychoactive substances will turn to opium. There'll be one lecture on opium. The next lecture will pick up historically on opium and then move to morphine and briefly consider briefly consider heroin, which is not found in the opium plant, unlike morphine and codeine, but is derived from tweaking morphine. And then we'll look at synthetic opioids very, very briefly, because we are focusing here on natural substances. Thank you.